I'm Andrew Hilland. I'm the Labour Party's candidate for Lanark and Hamilton East at the general election on 12th December.
From TLDR News, this is Too Long Didn't Read. Hillo and welcome to another special episode of the TLDR News podcast, Too Long Didn't Read. In this episode, we're going to share our full interview with Labour candidate Andrew Hilland. Andrew's currently running in Lanark and Hamilton East, and he also worked on the Better Together campaign during the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, as well as for the office of Gordon Brown. His constituency is also really fascinating, being one of the closest races in 2017. Back then, he came third, but was only about 300 votes behind the first place candidate. We sat down with him in his constituency to discuss what it's like running in a marginal seat and the issue of Scottish independence. We'll be using clips from this interview in a couple of our videos coming up, but we thought it was worthwhile to share the whole thing with you now. As with our interview with the Green Party, us releasing this isn't us condoning or signing off on his policies or arguments. It's simply us sharing his perspective with our viewers. That being said, let's get on with the interview.
Probably start with Scottish independence, if that's okay.
Of course.
So just first question, what do you think are the key benefits of being part of the Union of the United Kingdom?
Sure. It was always something that was quite intuitive to me. I suppose as someone who was brought up in Scotland to a very kind of patriotic Scottish family, but also had spent a bit of time living in England, I never felt that there should have to be a choice between being Scottish, which I would say, like many people in Scotland, was my primary identity, and being British, which was another side to my identity. Much like I don't think you should have to choose between being British and being European, as we see in the current debates around Brexit. It also kind of felt, as the direction of travel of the world became to a more kind of globalised economy, the challenge that we were facing, whether it be what you saw in the aftermath of the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, about having to work together to try and solve financial problems, or as we're seeing now with the challenges around the environment and climate change, or if you see with terrorism, there's this whole host of problems that are becoming quite prevalent in the modern world, and all of these seem to me to require countries to work together. So the notion that you would take a country of 5 million and put up a border with their closest neighbours on one island just seemed the most counterintuitive thing to me. So it always at that level just struck me as something that wouldn't necessarily be in keeping with the way the world was moving. So that was kind of, I suppose, a very high level intuitive reason why I was for Scotland being part of the United Kingdom.
What do you think on a more kind of economic level? Do you think there's key benefits to staying part of the Union?
Sure. I think very tangibly, every person in Scotland, I think, receives something like £2,000 a year more than kind of they put in taxes from being part of the United Kingdom. And that's just due to economies of scale, right? Obviously, Scotland has a particular challenge in that it's 1/3 of the UK's land size, but it accounts for, I think, 1/10 of, or even 1/12 of the population. So therefore, there was just an advantage to the term that I used when I started working on this issue, when I worked for the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. His way of putting it was we pool and share resources. And the benefits of that is we get that money that helps us fund our National Health Service. It helps us fund our schools. It helps pay for social security, so it guarantees we'll have the same pension as people in England and Wales have. But beyond that, I suppose also the UK currency, UK defence, being part of the UK when it comes to foreign policy and having embassies in every country around the world. So those were some of the more tangible benefits that I thought was always worth emphasising. That's not to say that Scotland can't take different decisions too. I mean, one of the benefits of devolution is that we now have a significant degree of autonomy through the Scottish Parliament. In fact, the breadth of powers that we have in Scotland are comparable to many states in the US or in Australia or in Canada, where you have devolution with significant powers. So it means that the Scottish Parliament actually has control over many important areas of life, including the Scottish NHS, including the police here, including education. And one of the things that came out the referendum was the ability to take a different course when it comes to welfare too, so that we had more powers to raise taxes and to top up social security if we wanted to chart a different path than the rest of the UK. So I think it's a balance. I think it's something that we're kind of always working on and trying to find the right balance. Mm-hmm. But I think it's that combination of having the kind of strength and security of the United Kingdom and the benefits that bring, but also have the ability to take different choices where the situation merits it.
So obviously you're in support of the union and you can see a lot of benefits of it, but what are your opinions on offering voters a second Scottish independence referendum? I mean, it's something that people have talked about. Would you ever support it if elected? Would you oppose it? Or
I think my initial reaction is that we only just had a referendum in 2014. Now that was billed by the leader of the SNP, Alex Salmond at the time, but also I think by everyone who was involved in it. Has been something that was once in a generation opportunity. Obviously in this election campaign, like the last election campaign, the SNP are running on the basis of we want a second Scottish independence referendum. Of course, you can never rule any of these things out indefinitely, particularly not if that's what the people of Scotland supported. But you also have to bear in mind that that's the SNP's raison d'etre. I mean, they will always be making the case for a second Scottish independence referendum. To me, the case for that will always shift for them, but in the end they always want the same thing. So the current justification is Brexit. That's why they say we need another independence referendum. But we haven't yet seen the consequences of Brexit. We don't know what the deal will be like. And I think at this election, Labour is standing on a platform where we're promising to resolve the Brexit issue one way or another within 6 months. You know, the SNP originally said, we need to have a second referendum on Brexit. But now they're saying that even if we were to have a second referendum on Brexit, and even if there was a vote to remain across the UK, that they'd still want Scottish independence, which to me means that they're not really serious about working out the practical consequence of this issue. They just want independence no matter the cost. So in direct response to your question, I think I wouldn't ever want to rule it out, because ultimately Scotland's future should be a matter for the people of Scotland. I don't think a rush to it at this point is the right response at all. I think we should take stock. I think we should try and resolve the current crisis we're in, which is Brexit. And I also think that a Labour government across the UK would bring such substantial benefits to the people in Scotland that it would make Scottish independence much less attractive to many of the people who live and work here.
On the Brexit point, one of the key arguments we've seen from people in our polling of Scottish viewers of our channel is that it's a substantially different situation from where we were last time that you guys voted on independence. That because we've had the Brexit situation, it looks like Scotland is likely to leave the EU with the UK. And one of the core arguments before was that people wanted to remain in the UK because they didn't want to lose their EU membership. Now we've almost got the literal opposite of that, in the fact that if they don't leave, they're likely to leave their membership. If they do leave, they could retain it. What do you think that argument of the fact that Brexit has substantially changed the debate on Scottish independence?
Well, I should be very clear that I support Scotland being a member of both the UK and the EU, like I campaigned in Scotland being part of the UK in 2014. I also campaigned passionately for the UK, including Scotland, to remain part of the EU in 2016. And I do support a kind of final say referendum on Brexit, precisely for the reason that I think there were a lot of mistruths told in that first referendum, everything from the 350 million on extra for the NHS on the side of a bus to the whole issue around, I think it was Dr. Liam Fox said that this would be the easiest trade deal in the history of trade deals. All of that has not been proven to be true. So for that reason, I would support another referendum and I would campaign to remain in the EU. But I also think you have to treat some of these claims with a bit of scepticism too. I mean, the SNP's argument, Nicola Sturgeon's argument as articulated for why Scotland needs to remain in the EU is ostensibly an economic one. She says that we have all this trade and jobs with the European Union. If we actually look at the figures, and this is by the Scottish Government's own publication, Scotland does 12 billion of trade with its neighbours in the European Union. We do 3.5 times that amount of trade with our friends in England and Wales and the rest of the UK. So the notion somehow that the answer to the mess that we've seen of Brexit and all the difficulties that arise when you try and put up a border between the UK and the EU is to put up a border between Scotland and England. Think of all the chaos and times it by almost 4. That's what we're seeing here. So actually, I don't think we should be forced to choose in this way. And that's why I'm putting the argument that we should be both a member of the UK and a member of the EU. And I think, to be honest, at this election, we have a choice that can give us that outcome, which is the Labour Party.
So just to be sort of very clear on that, one of the questions I did just want to ask was, you've said that you don't support a second Scottish independence referendum as of yet, maybe in the future, but currently, as it's just happened. but you would support a second EU referendum. And I just wanted to ask, what's the differentiating factor between why there should be a second EU referendum, considering there was one only a few years ago, but not a second Scottish independence
Well, I think
referendum?
the key differentiator is that the EU referendum, it was the change option that won. It was the option to come out of the EU, but the change that was being offered was not well prescribed at all. And actually, I think much of the basis for it has been proven to not be true in the years that has followed. So I think in that case, it's about going back to the people and saying, actually, we accept that you voted to leave. Now that we have a tangible set of terms, and by the way, Labour, if they form the government, would put forward a tangible set of terms, there would be a deal that would protect workers' rights, the environment and jobs, and then we take that back to the people and say, now knowing what we know and knowing how the last 3 years have played out, do you want to leave on these specific terms as opposed to some of the terms that you were promised that have proven not to be true? And then if you do, then we'll respect it. And there may also be a similar scenario in Scotland where it may be a case of either having a very defined offer up front, or a case for having to ratify that once it's been done.
So I'm just going to move on slightly to sort of battleground constituencies.
Sure.
So just the fact that in the last election here, between the first candidate and the third candidate, that was yourself, there were only 300 votes, which, if you look at some other constituencies with safe seats, it's a very marginal seat here.
Yes.
And I just wanted to ask, just sort of generally speaking, how was that in terms of campaigning with it being so close? What was it? Could you tell on the campaign that it was so close? Was it?
Yeah, we could tell it was close the last time. I mean, the challenge last time for us that Labour had historically held this seat, but in 2015, when the SNP had claimed most of the seats in Scotland, there was a swing so that Lanark and Hamilton East went from essentially being a Labour safe seat to the SNP holding it by 10,000 votes. So the last time we could tell that it might be close. I'm not quite sure I could tell it was 360 votes close. I think my best guess might be 2,000 votes. It was only actually we turned up to the count and started seeing the boxes. We thought this could be very close.
Yeah.
I think one of the kind of challenges about it being that close, and we see this in the current campaign, is that you see a real range of voters and a real range of different issues, right? So for some voters that we speak to, their primary objective is to get rid of Boris Johnson and the Tories. So they're concerned about the impact of austerity in these communities. So Lanark and Hamilton East, you have 1 in 4 children currently growing up in poverty in this area. And by the IFS projections, that's meant to rise to 1 in 3 within a matter of years. You have cuts that are visible to people across the community. So you have care homes that are being closed. You have bus routes that are being withdrawn. You have town centres. Lanark and Hamilton East comprises 4 or 5 town centres, and people are just dissatisfied with the state of them. You have shops lying empty, and I think that's the impact of not only people deciding to go into Glasgow to do their shopping or shopping online, but also just years of underfunding. So people are very dissatisfied with years of Tory government and cuts, much of which has been passed on to the SNP. And there is this class of voter who essentially says, we just want rid of Boris Johnson and the Tories. And then we're making the case, well, if you want to do that, you have to vote Labour, because in the Westminster election you'll get a Labour government or a Tory government. So regardless of what you think about the SNP or any other party, a vote for us is the clearest way to ensure you can get a Labour government and get rid of Boris Johnson. So that's your kind of want rid of Boris Johnson type voter, want a progressive Labour government. The other type of voter is a type of voter that's motivated by the independence argument. So these voters will say, I'm absolutely fed up with the SNP constantly banging on about Scottish independence. I suppose what I was trying to articulate a couple of questions ago, that they just, no matter what happens, their answer is another independence referendum. And all this is happening while the SNP have substantial governing powers and have been governing Scotland for over a decade, but they're letting schools and hospitals kind of fall into chaos on their watch. They are not spending 550 million of their allocated budget a year. They are not taking on the welfare powers that they've earned from the UK government, because their entire focus is on the constitution. So for these voters that we speak to, they are very much motivated by trying to stop this, and by having an MP and a government that will focus on bringing people together rather than by dividing them. So to say that's one of the kind of challenges, but one of the things that makes it quite exciting is that you talk to different people with kind of competing objectives, and the challenge for me is to put forward a vision that combines the two imperatives, right? That you can have a progressive future where we address the cuts and the austerity with a Labour government, but at the same time we can do so with a strong Scottish Parliament within the United Kingdom and hopefully also within the European Union.
Mm-hmm. So obviously you just mentioned it being quite challenging. I was just wondering, how much support do you get from the centralised Labour Party, considering how marginal this seat was in the previous election?
Yeah, we get a lot of support, and I think that's something that's grown from the last election to this election. We are fortunate that, as the Scottish Labour Party, we kind of work as a team with them, and we have a kind of dedicated support team working out of Glasgow, but they're very good at terms of providing us with financial support, but also advice and helping us with leaflets and all these kind of other things. So ultimately, all the decisions in the campaign are made by the candidate. So that you do have that degree of autonomy, but you also have these amazing people, party staff work in Glasgow that you can draw on, and certainly that's something that's the support has improved even since the last time in 2017, just because this is now one of the key targets. And in fact, if Labour is going to form a government, we have to be winning seats like this in Scotland. I sometimes say the road to a Labour government at this election runs through Scotland, insofar as we have 20 seats in Scotland that I think a 2% swing to Labour would win, essentially. So it's really key for us. And I think Jeremy Corbyn appreciates that too. He was in Hamilton in this constituency just about 2 weeks ago as part of a tour of key marginals in Scotland. We also had the Shadow Brexit Secretary Keir Starmer came up just over a week ago. And we had Gordon Brown here last Saturday, and we're hoping to have more people come visit us between now and the election. So I think it's something that not only the Scottish Labour Party based in Bath Street in Glasgow are very focused on, but also the whole Labour movement is really dedicated to helping make Lanark and Hamilton East a Labour gain.
So they're sending you the big guns then? Former Prime Ministers, leaders?
Yeah, exactly. We're very fortunate in that sense. So they're all doing their best to help us win.
Yeah, it's something we noticed. We spotted all those people on your social media, the fact that those people are around. How much do you think that helps in a constituency like yours, having major figures come? Do you think it makes a difference to you as a candidate or to the voters? How do you think it impacts things?
I think a bit of everything. I think it certainly makes a help to me as a candidate and to our team of activists. I should say we have an incredible team, probably about 30, 40 activists who are out in the freezing cold weather. And people said when this election was called, well, you will never get folk out canvassing in November and December, and you might call us crazy, but these people are out, they're knocking the doors, they're working round the clock to do it. So I think it certainly galvanises them when they have the leader of the Labour Party, when they have a former Prime Minister, when they have someone who could be the person negotiating Brexit for Labour coming up here. I think it also puts a spotlight in the constituency by showing that Labour's taking it seriously and that Labour can win it. So it won't be surprising to you, or maybe surprising to you, that the Tories and the SNP's almost exclusive message in this seat is only the SNP can beat the Tories, or only the Tories can beat the SNP. So they focus very much on this being what they term a two-horse race. And they produce all these dubious bar charts, particularly the Tories produce a bar chart that's managed to totally take out Labour, despite the fact we were totally 360 votes behind winning the seat. So, I always think the best way to counter that is with policies and with ideas, and I suppose that's one of the things that Labour has done. We've produced this manifesto that has ideas from, the Green New Deal to kind of scrapping universal credit, introducing a £10 minimum wage. So that's the best way of kind of combating that narrative. But I suppose it's also good for people giving the seat attention and realising that this is it's a three-horse race, so to speak, and that Labour's in it and we're planning to win it.
You touched on some of the kind of core policies that you're running on this year as a party, and we recently ran a poll with our viewers to find out which topics, which policies struck hardest with them, which ones they thought were the most important. And across the UK, this wasn't specifically Scotland, the top 3 results we got were Brexit, the environment and health. Do you think that reflects pretty well in what you're seeing in your constituency? Are those what people are talking about here?
I think people are talking about Brexit and Scottish independence. I suppose I've already alluded to Scottish independence. Much of what they're saying about Brexit is when you knock on the doors, there's a state of disillusionment, because I think people want to focus on the substantive issues, but the reaction is kind of, why should I vote for anyone? The country's in a mess. And also, and I think this is kind of worrying for someone who's passionate about politics and trying to get involved as an MP, is this kind of sense of, with the best will in the world, and you may be a nice guy, what are politicians going to do for me anyway? I think that's maybe a result of the financial crisis and the failure, certainly since 2010, to adequately address both the causes and the consequences of that. So I think you have to get past that, and I think Brexit, maybe to an extent Scottish independence, is the initial frame where people go, this is a mess, I just want it over, I want to focus on other things, essentially. As for the topics you mentioned, I mean, certainly the NHS is a big one. It's like particularly emotive, of course, because every family, I'm sure, like you, my family, have relied on it, so people care passionately about it. And I think the message that we've been putting forward, which is, this election you've got a choice between Boris Johnson, who's going to put the NHS on the table as part of a trade deal with Donald Trump, as opposed to Labour, who founded the NHS, who was responsible the last time we were in government for a massive increase in its resources, and who will invest in its future. So I think that's a big thing for people. But there are others too. I mean, the Tories have decided to scrap the free TV licence for the over 75s, taking effect next year. And that's been very resonant. Where we've been speaking to people that would be affected by that. Many people rely on it. There are thousands, I think there's about 5,000 households in this constituency who get the free TV licence but stand to lose it from next year. And for many of them, £150 is not money that they necessarily have to pay for that. So I've been meeting with people who've been affected, and that's something that's resonant too. I think another one I would say is the WASPI policy that we announced. I think it was last week, and I've also been speaking to some of the women who were born in the 1950s and whose state pension age was increased by the Tory government. And I think Labour's offer to compensate these women has been very welcomed by them. Of course, it's not full compensation necessarily for everything that they've lost, but I think in recognising the injustice and seeking to remedy it, that's something that a lot of people have really warmed to. So I'm kind of quite excited about so many policies. That I realised you started with 3 and I'm giving you a big list. Those are just a few of those that have resonated.
Interesting, just bouncing off that, I just probably won't make it into the video, I'm just generally interested. When you go to someone's door, when you're talking to people on the street, how many of them do talk about specific things they care about from like a policy perspective, things like pensions or things like TV licensing, and how much of it is based on national optics, what they think of the leaders, what they think of like general things?
It's hard to put a figure on it. I mean, some people, when you go and speak to them at the door, will just immediately tell you who they're voting for. They'll just say, I'm Labour son, you've got my vote. Then you just kind of thank them, and you don't really necessarily get into policy discussion. And other people, don't necessarily have time. I think it's something that we think when I'm sure you think when you're doing videos about politics, and I certainly think as someone who's trying to be an MP that everybody thinks about these issues all the time, but people are busy, right? So most of the time you knock on the door, people have got 2 kids running about, they're trying to cook dinner, or maybe they're doing the school run, or they're looking after an elderly family member. So most people, or a lot of people I would say, don't necessarily have the time to sit about debating on the issues. But certainly once you get into it with people do raise things they've heard about. Some of them are just at the local level, if you look at the state of that street, in which case I put the balloon squarely at the door of the SNP-led South Lanarkshire administration. But I think, people then do raise some very substantive issues, and those are some of the ones that resonate. But there are others. I mean, the £10 minimum wage is one that I've not mentioned, but I spoke to a guy the other day and he was saying, his daughter works in like a chip shop, and by the time she's paid her bus fare there and back, the money that she's taken home almost doesn't make it worth it.
Sure.
So you do have a lot of these kind of substantive conversations, and then it's kind of a case if people don't know about Labour's particular policy on it, it's a case about kind of trying to explain how people would benefit from it.
So just while we're on the topic of policies, one of the things that's been introduced in Scotland but hasn't been introduced in the rest of the UK is 16 and 17-year-old voting. I was wondering what your views on that policy was, and what impact you think it's had on democracy so far in Scotland?
I think it's been a good thing. I would encourage it being rolled out across the UK. It was interesting that when Jeremy Corbyn came to this constituency, came to Hamilton just last week, an enormous crowd of 16 and 17-year-olds turned up from the local school. So they all came and they waited outside for about an hour for the bus to arrive, and they started kind of chanting Jeremy Corbyn and holding up Labour posters, which to me suggested that actually their level of engagement was high, and that their appetite for a politician and a politics that was forward-looking and offered a bit of hope was strong, you know. And it's one of the things that gives me a bit of hope as well, that, you know, at the moment, for the last few years, we've been stuck in these constitutional debates, and I perfectly respect and recognise a lot of people had a good reason to vote leave, like a lot of people had good reason to vote yes in the Scottish independence referendum. But it has meant that the country, both the UK, and I think we've seen this particularly in England now, what we've seen in Scotland for a few years has been quite divided and polarised along these constitutional lines, and you feel like the argument goes round in circles a little bit. So the fact that young people are showing an appetite to get involved in politics and are showing an interest in some of these kind of policy ideas that I've discussed gives me a lot of optimism.
So, if you wouldn't mind just going slightly back to a previous conversation just about your attempt in 2017 to be elected.
Sure.
One of the questions me and Jack were actually talking about earlier today was, what's it like not winning that seat? So obviously you've spent a long time campaigning, and you know, I'm sure you put a lot of effort and time campaigning in that. And I was just wondering, sort of like, what's the support like from the party after the election, and how was that just on a sort of personal level?
I mean, I think I felt overwhelmingly kind of proud, not just of the campaign I ran, but the campaign that the team ran, and some of the people that had worked so hard in that campaign. I mean, obviously personally, you know, the next morning I woke up and it kind of dawned on me I didn't win, and I came very close and I was quite upset about it. But I actually, even though it might sound like a cliche, I felt a lot more sorry for everyone who'd worked so hard in the team, because obviously I was doing it to become the Member of Parliament, as well as wanting to be a Member of Parliament to address all these issues. But all these other people were giving up all their time because they believed in the cause and they were expressing a belief in me as well. So I kind of felt sorry for them, but then I kind of just immediately committed, we'll try and do that again, we'll try and win it, we'll fight on. And as for the party, I mean, there was support there. Everyone was really supportive, went and spoke to them afterwards, had a bit of a debrief, focused on the future. So I didn't have an awful lot of time to reflect on it. And it's probably one of the things I found working for Gordon Brown the most, that he is very good at that. Like if there's a knock, like if there's a bad result, like the EU referendum was a bad result and not what we campaigned on, he doesn't spend an awful lot of time reflecting on it. He just kind of wakes up the next morning and thinks, right, this is what we need to do, here's what the next steps are. And I think that's quite a good way to treat these things.
And what have you been doing in between elections? What sort of work have you been doing? Have you been?
A bit of different stuff. Like I'm a lawyer by background,
okay.
So I worked on a project with Gordon Brown, but also with a lawyer in London called Shahid Fatima QC, called the Inquiry on Protecting Children in Conflict, and that was all about enhancing the international human rights and humanitarian legal protections for children in war zones, to try and kind of prevent the incidence of children in Syria or in Yemen or in Iraq and Afghanistan being killed, being raped, being maimed, being recruited as child soldiers in war. So that launched last year, a kind of big report, and I contributed to the report, but also contributed to rolling it out and trying to get traction and support for it among that community. So that was one of the big things I've done since. But also since I've been selected, which was in the summer of 2018, also running a lot of local campaigns around here. So it's drawn attention to the impact the universal credit was having, particularly on young people, disabled people in the community as well. And also campaigning against the closure of care homes by the SNP and Tories on South Lanarkshire Council. So there was a care home closed in Lark Hall. They were threatening to reduce the number of beds and may still well reduce the number of long-term residential beds in Lanark, which is a particular issue given that the demand for residential care with their ageing population is growing, and yet at one and the same time they're cutting the number of beds that are available. So kind of mixture of doing kind of legal, kind of human rights campaigning work on the one hand, and locally working as a Labour candidate to try and give voice to some of the issues that people care about locally.
Sorry, just going back to another previous conversation. Sure. So with the SNP, can you ever see your party doing a deal with the SNP, or would you personally? What's your personal views?
I don't think so. I mean, once you realise that the SNP's primary objective in these things is always the breakup of the United Kingdom, I think as someone who's committed to advance socially just and progressive policies through the UK, I don't think we should countenance any deal whatsoever with the SNP. And I think with all these things, if Labour was in a position where it was a minority government, we put up some of these policies I've been talking about. We put up the policies for 100 billion of investment in Scotland's communities and public services and economy in the next 10 years. And if the SNP want to vote that down, that's for them to do so.
Okay.
On the SNP thing as well, and while we're talking about it, how do you feel about the future of Scottish Labour generally? We've seen recently, even back earlier in this decade, Scottish Labour were really dominant, like 50 kind of MPs most of the time, somewhere around there. And then in kind of 2015, 2017, we saw that drop off fairly significantly as the SNP obviously took the place. So I'd be interested in how you feel about Scottish Labour in this election specifically, and also going forward, what you think the future is. Do you see it swinging back the other way, or do you think Scottish Labour is kind of a waning force?
Well, I think the lesson that we have to take from 2014 and the referendum is that you can't take anything for granted. I mean, Scottish Labour, you can't assume that it's going to be around forever. You know, people have to fight to ensure that it's relevant. And I think in this election, positive thing is we're putting forward some very positive policies, not only through the UK manifesto, but also some of the work that Richard Leonard's been doing in Scotland. But you know, you have to continue to work hard to maintain relevance. And I think one of the difficulties in Scotland is that in the 2017 election, and to some extent since then, a lot of people voted for the SNP based on desire for independence, or because they thought the SNP were a voice for people in Scotland, and a lot of people voted for the Tories because they were very strong on this single issue of kind of, we'll stop Scottish independence. I think in truth Labour has to have an answer to those questions. Like, Labour has to put the progressive case as to why Scotland should be part of the United Kingdom, and we shouldn't shy away from that. I think we have to put that case to people who are thinking voting Tory as well. You know, like when the Tories say vote for the Conservatives to keep the United Kingdom together, to me it's almost laughable, because the Tories and Boris Johnson are by far the biggest threat to the unity of the United Kingdom. And the Tories at this election campaign here are acting almost as if the last 2 years didn't happen. In fact, the Tories candidate, I read, she gave an interview, she gave a response to a piece that we'd done for one of the papers, where she said, the mess we've seen with Brexit shows why we shouldn't go for another Scottish independence referendum, seemingly entirely oblivious to the fact that it was her party that caused it. Now, I think we have to go out and expose those kind of untruths, and to say, well, you know, if you vote for the Tories, they will tell you it's a vote to keep Scotland in the United Kingdom, but actually it's a vote for a hard and no deal Brexit. It's a vote for 5 more years of austerity, which I think do more than anything to fuel the case for Scottish independence in the view of many people here. And also there was a recent poll saying that 62% of Conservative members across the United Kingdom would actually accept Scottish independence or losing Scotland as a price to pay for Brexit. So I think in the future of Labour Party we have to point these two things out, and we have to be very strong and clear on them, but at the same time continuing to champion, develop some of the policies that have been developed by Richard Leonard and Jeremy Corbyn and that you see in the current manifesto.
And I can't remember whether we discussed this when we were filming. I don't think we were at this point. But it'd be interesting to hear you speak on how you feel Labour's policies on Scottish independence have been, like the success of them this time round. We were talking before about how they've been kind of vague about where the party stands on it. Do you think that's helped or hurt you in this campaign?
I think what Labour has laudably done to a greater or lesser degree in every election since 2014 is to recognise that some traditional Labour voters voted for independence based on social justice reasons. In an effort to win some of these voters back, Labour has struggled to know how much to emphasise that Labour is for Scotland's place in the United Kingdom. I think that's the reality of it. I think at this election we should be clear that Labour is for Scotland being part of the UK, that we're passionate about that, and that we don't believe that we should have another independence referendum at this time for the reasons I've outlined. But we should also be putting the case that actually if you're concerned as someone who might have voted SNP or be sympathetic to independence, is to get rid of Boris Johnson and the Tories, then the way to do that is to vote Labour.